Well, welcome everybody. It's a chilly night, so wherever you are, I hope you're safe and snug, and thank you very much indeed for looking in. My name's David Sidwick. I'm the Dorset Police and Crime Commissioner. And normally I like to go out and actually talk to people face to face, but we've got a bit of an issue at the moment, as everybody is aware, with the pandemic. So for that reason, sadly, face-to-face meetings, particularly with lots of people, aren't advisable. So instead, these events are being held online. We're running two. We're running one this evening with the BCP Council area, and also tomorrow evening for the Dorset Council area. So I'd like to make an introduction. I'm joined tonight by Chief Superintendent Mark Callaghan, who is the local police area commander for BCP. Once myself and Mark have said a few words of introduction, we'd like to start going through your questions. This very much is about you. It's about you asking me questions about my police and crime plan, but also more importantly at this time, it's also asking me questions about my plans for the precept. I'd like to basically tell you that this session is being recorded and it'll be available later for you. So on with tonight's event. Most of you will be familiar with the role of the PCC, but I should probably reiterate basically what I do. I'm an elected representative by the people, and therefore I very much represent the people of Dorset. And my responsibilities is to hold the Chief Constable and the police force to account. And one of the primary ways I do that is by setting what's called the police and crime plan. I work with partners, I support victims and the criminal justice system. And tonight's real subject, which is about setting the police budget and precept, but I'll come to that later. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update about where we are. I was elected on May the 6th, came into office on May the 13th, and very clearly there was a job to do. What I did was put in place a 100-day plan. We succeeded with that. We did 50 things in those 100 days. And then we started at the same time to put together the police and crime plan. Now, in theory, we had nearly a year to do that, but I'm very pleased to say that actually what we did was have that plan in place by the end of October, which clearly sets out my vision to make Dorset the safest county in England and Wales. Now, the interesting thing about that plan is it wasn't really my plan. It was built on what you told me during my 3 years campaigning. So very much the priorities are your priorities. And those were translated straight from my election literature, my promises, if you like, into the plan that's there today. So what are we basically going to do? We're going to have 6 priorities. The first one, very clearly, was to cut crime and antisocial behaviour. And antisocial behaviour was a particular issue. My surveys and people across Dorset basically had that as the number 1 or 2 priority, depending on where you were. And immediately I asked the force for a response. They stepped up and put in place something called Operation Relentless. So we now have a priority around antisocial behaviour. The second priority is about making police more visible and connected and engaged with their communities. So that is partly about resource, partly about the uplift, the extra police that you've heard about, but it's also about doing things slightly differently and making certain that we're truly engaged with our communities. The third priority is about fighting violent crime and high harm. And there I'm talking about issues such as drugs, the violence that comes with them, the exploitation that comes with them. It's also about the hidden harms, the domestic abuse, the child abuse, which can go on in our homes. The fourth priority, which is less prevalent in the BCP area, is about fighting rural crime. And then I've got 2 other priorities, which sort of are threads through the others. One is putting victims and communities first and making certain that victims are supported and making certain that communities are supported where there are issues. And the last one is actually about making every penny count. So as that takes me directly into talking about funding and the precept, I'll leave that for a moment and we'll come back to it. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Mark basically to give us some further insight into policing in the BCP area. Over to you, Mark.
Cheers, thank you. Evening, everybody. So if I just start with an overview of the types of crimes, and David's already talked about some of those areas and some of our priorities. But ultimately, I'm the BCP local policing area, so Chief Superintendent responsible for local policing, which includes the patrol officers answering 999 calls and doing that initial investigation, our serious and complex crime teams, so that the traditional CID, and our prisoner handling teams. Our neighbourhood policing, which includes safeguarding, and also our missing persons teams, which I'll talk about more in a second, and along with that, our neighbourhood enforcement teams. But I think if we look at some of our priorities, I've been policing now for 23 years. And during that 23 years, we've seen crime change. We've seen more vulnerability, more high harm crime. And actually, if we look at the streets of the BCP area, we know that our priorities are around that antisocial behaviour, the county lines, the drugs problems, the child exploitation, the knife carrying, and that youth-related public violence that we're seeing. But not forgetting the traditional crimes, the burglaries, all those thefts. Crime has evolved, but we still have traditional crimes really important to people. And one of the most important crimes is people feeling safe in their homes. But of course, we've always talked about violence against women and girls, the sexual and physical violence that's also involved in child exploitation. And not to mention the significant increase we've had in missing persons. I could go on and talk about all our crime types. BCP is a busy area with lots of different types of crimes taking place and criminality. But what's really clear are high harm crimes linking to most serious violence, serious sexual crime, county lines and drugs is something that we really need to tackle and are continuing to do so. But I want to reaffirm, Dorset is a really safe place to live in comparison to other areas. But our biggest drive is to make Dorset even safer and make sure that people living in Dorset and visiting Dorset feel safe. So as part of my role, I don't only responsible for policing, I also chair the Community Safety Partnership and work closely with child safeguarding, adult safeguarding, our health colleagues, fire and education in making sure that actually we do a whole system approach. So we look at the whole system of societal issues, crime, to try and prevent and problem solve and try and enable our communities to make sure that they can help themselves and have the right access to systems, but actually we're aware of all the issues that are going on in our communities. And I think that's what's, moving on to the next part, what's really important, actually, understanding our communities. We're here to serve our communities. And in, BCP, we have very affluent areas, and we also have significant areas of deprivation and poverty. And I think a big area of those considerations when you overlay crime is there's a significant amount of crime in those deprived areas as well, which links to education, hygiene poverty, etc., and food poverty. So what are we doing about it? In a moment, the PCC will talk more about precept, but what are we already doing? You'll be aware of the National Uplift Programme, where we're seeing more resources, and those resources are going into patrol resources, so those officers answering our 999 calls and our 101 calls. We're also putting some more resourcing into our neighbourhood policing, so the Bobby on the beat, the focus on increasing some resource into our neighbourhoods to actually look at long-term problem solving and safeguarding in our communities. The other areas where we're increasing, we're creating missing person teams dedicated to delivering against repeat missing persons, both children and adults. And every day you'll see in the press and you'll see the work we do that every day we have high risk missing persons that we're dedicated to locating and then working with partners to safeguard. One of the more exciting places that we're putting resources about neighbourhood enforcement. We really want, and our plan is to have neighbourhood exploitation teams and neighbourhood enforcement teams. The idea, and we're already starting to bring these teams online, is to really look at those local neighbourhood problems, those committing crime through either exploitation, making communities' lives miserable. And we want to make the environment toxic. We want to target those people. And, as others will say, people say to me in the public when I speak to people, take back the streets, make sure that we're dealing with all those criminality that's causing us harm and causing the fear of crime. Well, I can reassure you that's very much our ambition. That's very much what we're doing. And we're starting to develop the proactive capability that you'll start seeing on the streets of BCP. And in addition, with that uplift resources, we'll also be increasing in some of our investigations, safeguarding, but particularly around our serious sexual offences, so rape, etc., in those areas. So that's enough from me for the moment. I'll hand back to David for any questions or anything further you want to talk about.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. So now you've heard a bit about the police delivery of the plan. So this leaves me to talk about the specific issue of the precept. So one of my priorities was very clear. It's to make every penny count. And I promised the people of Dorset to be transparent when it came to the funding of the police force, and I intend to honour that promise. So the funding for the police comes from two places. It comes from a grant from the government, which is allocated according to a national funding formula, and it comes from what's called the precept, which is part of the council tax for the local area. Now, the majority of the government grant increase, which we'll receive for 2022 and 23, is expected to be focused on the delivery of the government's manifesto pledge to deliver the 20,000 officers nationally. So the extra increase from the government will actually be on more officers for us. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't do a couple of things. It doesn't take into account for inflationary pressures. Now, those are particularly high at the moment. We all know that. So this is the costs of everything we buy, training, equipment, vehicles. It's the cost of the fuel. It's the cost of the heating for the buildings which those officers will use. Such costs have to be met and is part of the local council tax precept, which I'm trying to raise. If it's not, then we've got to take that money from everywhere else. Now, I noticed in the comments, comments about we'd like to see more police on the streets, and absolutely I echo that. You saw my second priority was very much about visibility, and part of that is the uplift. So the extra officers will be in the neighbourhood policing teams, the neighbourhood enforcement teams, exactly as Mark said. So they will be in the communities. You will see them, but we've got to do everything else as well. Now, the government has announced the budget for policing, and that presumes that PCCs raise by £10 a year. So that's not just me, that's every PCC in the country will be doing the same thing as myself and asking the residents what they think about that £10 a year. And that's based on those living in an average Band D property. So some people will obviously not be in a Band D property and won't pay £10. They'll pay whatever is appropriate. Now, what that actually means is that means 83p a month. If we have that, then what we can do is we can satisfy all the needs currently. We can satisfy the inflationary pressures. But more importantly, you very clearly said to me what you wanted. Very clearly, that's in the police and crime plan. And what that extra allows me to do is it allows me to do some of the things that I said there. So we're going to be able to strengthen the neighbourhood policing, the neighbourhood policing teams, the neighbourhood enforcement teams to prevent antisocial behaviour and crime in your communities. We want to improve customer service. And I use those words deliberately. We want to transform the way that Dorset Police talk to the public engagement, and also what's called the contact management systems. So we need to improve the way that people are able to report. We need to improve the way that Dorset Police report back about progress. And we need to improve services such as 101 and the emergency response. We talked earlier a bit about the fight violent crime and high harm. In the 10-year drug strategy, which the government announced just before Christmas, there were 10 towns across the UK which had the highest cocaine and heroin uses. Sadly, Bournemouth was there amongst those 10. So by letting me have this precept, we will be able to invest in a new county lines task force targeting organised drug supply in our communities. We're also going to be able to increase our capability in protecting and safeguarding children from online sex predators. And we're going to be able to have better use of specialist resources and partnership initiatives with the local council to help protect women and girls from violence, sexual assault and drink spiking as we go out in the nighttime economy and elsewhere. And although not so relevant here, we'll also be able to fight rural crime, which is another area which has been neglected over the last few years, by again expanding the rural crime team to protect the local communities and business owners there. I said there was a thread about putting victims and communities first. And there is a lot of investment we need to do. We need to invest in digital evidence. We need to invest in crime investigation capability. And also we need to invest in victim care. My office supports victim support across Dorset. As we bring more offenders to justice, we need to make certain that we support their victims. It's really time for us to take where we are now, to look forward and plan a brighter, safer future. But I really can't do that if we stand still. I can't do that without the precept. And I really hope that you're prepared to help me fund that future in the policing in your neighbourhood. I'm consulting on this at the moment. If you haven't done so already, please respond to my survey by going to dorsetpolicefunding.uk. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of questions, which I've got already, and then we'll see where we go with some of the live questions. So one of the questions which I've had is, shouldn't the government be providing this extra funding rather than expecting it to come from local taxpayers? Look, it's no secret that Dorset Police is one of the lowest funding forces in England and Wales. And part of my job is that I continue to make the case using all the evidence available to me, and I've had the force have a deep dive on evidence in order to help me with this, in order to go to government and continue to lobby about a change in the national funding formula. Now, they're in the process of doing that, and they're going to complete this work by the end of this Parliament. That doesn't help me in the meantime, but I'm also very optimistic that this time, when that funding formula is changed, we will have a better deal, more fairness for Dorset. And the reason that I am optimistic is because there is now much greater input from forces such as ours, which is rural, coastal and urban, rather than just the metropolitan areas. So I'm going to continue to constructively engage with the government, continue to lobby and make the case for Dorset. But in the meantime, I've got to make certain that we can do what we can do here. So police budgets have very much been set, and the expectation clearly from the government is that the PCC's raised the £10 precept. Now, I would love to be able to say, no, you know what? We don't actually need it this year. I can't do that. In order to deliver what I've talked about earlier, we need that precept. The second question, and this is very very pertinent actually. It says, doesn't Dorset Police need to cut its cloth accordingly and become more efficient? So this is something where I asked the question immediately I got into office about efficiency, about the budgets of the force. And in terms of becoming more efficient, the force has got a good track record. It's delivered over £14 million worth in savings since 2010. And as part of next year's budget, it's already identified significant savings in order to balance the books. And we have to do that. That is a requirement on us, again, from government, that we are as efficient as possible. So I'm committed to doing two things. I'm committed to lobbying to make certain that we get fairness in the future. I'm committed to optimizing the funding that we have. I'm also committed to doing the job with the money which you basically, hopefully, will agree that I need in order to go forward. So that was a couple of questions, and I'd like to basically take some live ones. So they'll be coming up in the live feed. What's our plans to stop the increase in knife crimes taking place? I think what I'm going to do, Mark, is we'll both answer this one. If I can ask you first of all, from the point of view of the actual numbers regarding regarding knife crimes,
Okay,
and what you're doing operationally, and then I'll talk generally.
Yeah, no, indeed. So knife crime nationally, we know in certain areas is quite significant. Dorset still has low levels of knife crime, but you'd be right, knife crime is still a problem. We still have youths carrying knives in the street, but it isn't a routine, everyday occurrence that we're seeing. Like we may see in more metropolitan areas, like the Met, for argument's sake, or the Metropolitan Police. However, knife crime still is a problem, still in our communities, and we do see some levels of violence involving knives, and we know some of the language used in schools is such as well. So, what do we already do? So, one of my roles. I'm also the strategic lead for most serious violence, which includes knife crime across Dorset. So, I'm linked into the regional and national work around most serious violence. If we start with what we do already in terms of school and education, through our Safer Schools teams, through our prevention department, we go into schools. So our firearms officers and trained officers go in and do educational programs with schools in order to try and really prevent and educate right at the early end. In terms of our enforcement, we monitor and track intelligence and individuals. So we day to day and through our tasking processes, we track potential intelligence around knife crime carriers, or if we've had people who've carried knives, they're proactively targeted. And that's an ongoing process where we look at what's causing the problems, why they're carrying knives, and how do we intervene, whether through prevention, through other interventions, or actually catch and convict and send them to court and deal with them appropriately. So that's using stop search powers. We've done activities. So in the gardens is a good example in Bournemouth. We've done proactive search activities based on intelligence to suggest maybe those involved with drugs were stashing knives in a location. We do regular sweeps of the parks to gather evidence and actually see if that is the case or not. I can give you reassurance that if there is, I'm a firearms commander for the force, and if there's mentions of knives and incidents of knives, the response that we give is an armed response to many of those incidents, or a taser response. So we deal with the threat as a credible threat, and we're really robust with them. We will also make sure that any knife crime offending around youths is not only just dealt with from a policing perspective, it's dealt with in a multi-agency perspective, from our youth offending through education, through working with social care, etc. So we have a robust plan, and I'm currently, based on a new evidence base that's come out from the College of Policing around what works with knife crime, which has come out recently. We're currently reviewing our strategy to see what else we can do to tackle knife crime. But a lot of that is often we're finding around the county lines drug dealing and the weapon of choice. We see less firearms carrying in Dorset, more knife carrying, and also youth related, that feeling. And that's what I was trying to understand. Is it for protection? Is it what's the reasons youth think they need to carry weapons, and try and discourage that? So hopefully that gives a flavour of where we are and what we're doing, but it is certainly a priority for us.
Thank you, Mark. If I can give my view very much on that. I mean, I looked at the numbers. And Mark's right. In Dorset, we have of the order of 300 knife offences. That doesn't mean that the knife has actually been used. It means that somebody's been caught with a knife as well. And if you want to put that into context, London has 13 to 14,000 knife offences. But we've got to step not only away from the policing response. We've also got to understand why it's happening. And there's a thread here. There's a thread around our young people. There is a thread around why is it acceptable to carry knives? Why is it acceptable to behave like drug lords? And I've got a whole piece in my police and crime plan, which I talk about, which is called Fix the Future. And that is about early intervention and diversion for our young people. We've got some great young people in Dorset, fantastic individuals. We want to make certain that we have as many as possible not going down that path. So there's a number of things that we're doing. Both, you've heard the extensive work that Mark's doing with the police force, but also we've got plans going forward in order to address that as well from the getting ahead of it point of view. Thank you. Are you going to recruit more police? Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to combine that with a question that I've got also, which is, we hear a lot about these new police officers. How is uplift going? So what the government did was they said there's 20,000 new officers, and you're going to get them in three lots. And we've had our first lot. So in Dorset, our March 2020 baseline was 1,267 officers. And our target was to recruit an additional 50, the first 50 in year one. We achieved that target, recruiting an additional 52 to take our headcount up to a total of 1,319 officers as of March 2021. The point I'll make about that is additional. That is not replacing those who retire or leave the force. This is additional officers in Dorset Police. Our target for this year is a further 50 officers, and that remains on track. Now, I'm very clear where these officers should go, and certainly for the first set of officers, that's exactly what happened. They are coming out into our communities. They're coming out as part of the neighbourhood area. So the one thing I will say is that actually from day one of the training until you have an officer who can actually be effective on the ground, it takes 3 years to complete the training fully, but it takes 36 weeks to get them to the point where they can come out on the ground and actually be part of the establishment stopping crime on our streets. So if you work that out, then that first 50 officers only hit the streets relatively recently. And that's the point. You won't feel the difference yet, but you will going forward. You heard from Mark earlier about the different teams which are out there. Now, those roles are protected. They can't be moved anywhere for a period of 68 or 120 weeks to allow them to gain operational competence, because they've got to basically get as much experience as possible within the force. So very clearly, yes, we are recruiting more officers, but above that, both the Chief Constable and I have an ambition that we go above uplift. In the first year, we were able to go 2 above uplift. We'll see where we are by the end of this year. So thank you for that question. Thank you, James. Mark, again, do you want to talk about the operational piece? This is about dangerous driving throughout the BCP area. And then I'll talk about where I want to go with this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So in terms of our dedicated response to high harm offending in terms of driving, dangerous driving, and those offenders that are drug and alcohol driving, as an example, we have a dedicated team called the No Excuse Team, and they are dedicated. And we also have special constables working in the No Excuse Team as well. So we have a mixture of regular officers and specials, and their focus is on targeting high harm offenders and those that are doing dangerous driving. We accept, part of that will also be with our traffic department, who are working on a focus on driving behaviours, focus on our collisions, our fatal and those seriously injured on our roads. But they are there. You may not see them. We have, through Dorset Road Safe, we have a significant amount of intelligence, and therefore we deploy things like the camera vans, etc. It's one against prevention, but also to target those. And we also have a partnership group with local authority, Highways England, etc., that looks at how we can make our roads safer, where we need to put our assets, and where we need to focus on improving driver awareness, etc. And that goes everything from highway maintenance, infrastructure, all the way through to catch and convict in terms of offenders. In addition to that, we have regular events that sometimes linked off national but drink drive campaigns, and particularly around some of our seasonal areas of Christmas, etc. You'll see those, and there is a focus on those. In addition to that, the patrol officers that are out and about doing their duties, which aren't traffic officers, they're general patrol officers, and our armed response vehicles, and other units that are in marked vehicles, will also proactively target against that dangerous driving, etc. And there's also the ability for you to submit dash cam footage, etc., in through Dorset Road Safe. And whilst it might not be a policing response immediately, we can then follow that up and make inquiries, etc., and link all the intelligence pieces together. And it's by that intelligence we might not be there when you see them, but actually we will then look at that intelligence, gather it together, and that can be through Dorset Road Safe, through Crime Stoppers, whatever it may be. We have an intelligence desk which is focused around road safety, and if people are cropping up as regular people or people at risk, we can then make sure we target them through intelligence-led policing approach. In terms of our cameras, obviously we've got the speed cameras that are in place, the average speed cameras along the 338, as well as our cameras being around the digital capabilities that they have now, rather than old film footage that was used previously from that perspective. David.
So from the point of view of investment in the traffic area, the road safety area, basically we've invested more each year for the last 3 years. Where I want to go in the future with this is very clearly, and the Chief shares this ambition, we want to basically use more ANPR cameras. We're looking very much at that, and that is from the point of view of catching the dangerous drivers, those which basically are repeat offenders, but it's also to allow us to use that capability in order to address issues like no MOT, no insurance, and inevitably the person who, a lot of people who don't have MOT or insurance are also doing other things as well. So the ANPR is a way that we can actually sort of start really sort of addressing the dangerous driving. We talked about drink driving. I also want to have campaigns around drug driving. At a different level, I'm intent to help and support community speed watch in order to basically drive down the lower level breaking of the speed limits in areas, or indeed the high level if it happens in the community speed watch area. And I'm also looking to support more things like Operation Snap, which Mark referred to, which is where people can send in photos of dangerous driving. So there's a lot going on in that regard. Thank you, Angelina. So let's be very, very clear. Drugs is something which we are going to deal with. There is a sea change in the philosophy around dealing with drugs in Dorset now. I have been very direct about I want tough enforcement. I want the dealers taken off the streets. I want those who are antisocial drug users who are making everybody's life a misery. I want those people to be addressed also. The exact example that you mentioned there, I am very clear that we are going to address that and stop the dealers targeting our schools. Now, the key to this, the big key to this is 4 things. One is the tough enforcement that I'm talking about. And you've heard that we're going to have a county lines task force, which will augment what we've already done. I'll give you one example of what we've done recently. We had a joint operation with Merseyside Police called Operation Medusa. And basically, Merseyside is one of the areas which sends the toxic substances down here. And we had 20 to 30 Merseyside detectives on the streets of Dorset, basically helping us at the end of the county line take down those crooks. And we're going to be doing more of that. We have a regional priority now, which would never happened before, but all 5 police and crime commissioners in the Southwest want to make the Southwest a hostile environment for drug dealers and antisocial drug users. And that means that we can look at things like putting a ring of steel around the Southwest, working with British Transport Police, looking at ANPR, doing a lot of things that we weren't able to do. So that's the enforcement end of it. We've also got to have effective rehabilitation. For those who are addicted to heroin or cocaine or whatever, we've got to make certain that we have rehabilitation which works. And that is why I am spending a lot of time having a national portfolio called Addiction and Substance Misuse. And our next big chunky piece of work is basically to audit rehabilitation. And what I'm after is I'm after stuff that works. We need to invest in that. We need to drive that. But getting rid of stuff which doesn't work. And then we come to the point, the nub of it is, how do we stop this for the future? I want to see impactful education for our young people. I know there are primary schools where there are kids as young as 8 and they are acting out drug lord behaviors in the playground. And that's because when they are 7 years old, when they make the transfer from infant to junior, some of them are given mobile phones, and that immediately is a computer. And you can start seeing all sorts of stuff on there. I'm very clear we've got to get ahead of this. And when we talk to our young people, we can't say, don't do it. If you try and tell a bunch of teenagers, don't do something, I'm not certain that's a recipe for an easy option going forward. The second point is, if you tell them about all the drugs, they've known about the drugs for years. If you also say there will be consequences, yes, okay, but nobody's going to catch me. We have to talk to them about the risks. We have to talk to them about MDMA. MDMA, and let me take a specific example. India Thacker, one of my best friend's daughters, died on the floor of the O2 Arena, it'll be 3 years ago this May, from taking MDMA. And we see too many of our young people dying from taking MDMA. We've got to talk about the risks. If we look at ketamine, ketamine's an anesthetic. Ketamine is not something you want to be addicted to, because it will rot. It will rot the peace between your bladder and the external world. Let's put it that way. There is a couple of kids rolling around Dorset who don't have bladders. Imagine what their lives are actually like. And if we talk about cannabis for a moment, there is now huge bodies of data coming out of places like the United States where they can look at population data, and they're seeing a direct link between cannabis and cancer, cannabis and birth defects, cannabis and aging. So we have to talk to our children about the risks. So there's a whole program which we're bringing forward, not just locally, but also regionally and linked up nationally with the 10-year drug strategy. So I hope that gives some reassurance. We're aware of the issue, and now we're going to tackle it.
I think they want to read these out as well. So, is Dorset Police considering electric cars with a fleet of 5 EVs in our driving school? I can tell you the first-hand electric cars are far more cost-effective. Do you want to answer this one, or do you want me to? Because we've already got some electric vehicles.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the ones you've got, and then I'll talk about where I am on that?
Yeah, definitely. So we already have a number of electric vehicles that we're using and piloting to see how we can use, and they're in use by our police community support investigators and those going out doing inquiries that don't require a blue light response, because obviously the challenges are around the blue light response with our electric vehicles. We also use our vehicles. We have a pool of cars. So if somebody needs to book a car to go to Exeter, for argument's sake, part of that fleet is electric cars as well. So we're actively going forwards with this, and obviously, David, you'll give your view of the future around our electric fleet.
Yeah, look, my view is I was heartened by what the questioner said when he said that they were actually more cost effective. My view is twofold. I am intent on making certain that we drive for sustainability. I am intent that we basically look at reducing our carbon footprint, and that goes across the force. What I'm very keen on, though, is that, one, we have to make every penny count. So whatever we buy, it has to be a cost-effective solution for what we need to do. Otherwise, it will be basically compromising something elsewhere. And the other point I'll make about this is, yes, absolutely, but not if it compromises operational effectiveness. And though that is the balance that we've got to have. So for lots of things, as Mark's referred to, an electric vehicle would be perfect. But we also have things where we wouldn't take the risk. We need the current situation with diesel or petrol or whatever. So that gives you a philosophical position of where I am.
So the next question is, what about special constables? Do you intend to increase these numbers? Thanks, Lindsay King.
Yes, absolutely. I've had discussions already about it. We're looking to increase special constables, and the target we're driving for is 25%.
We're also looking at different models because we've got so many student officers coming through as regulars. We're looking at how we can speed up the training and the delivery and where we deploy our special constables, because they're very much part, just like our police staff volunteers are, they're very much part of the policing family. So certainly, definitely, we're actively encouraging our citizens in policing. And of course, we have our cadet scheme as well now as well. What plans are in place to tackle the obvious increase in car break-ins within the BCP conurbation and the mole man?
I very clearly see that one's for you, Mark, because that's an operation solution you need to address that.
Indeed. So we monitor all our volume crime and looking at those types of breaks in, and we have a dedicated priority crime team. So their focus is on that serious acquisitive crime. So burglaries, some of the street robberies, and where we have a series of break-ins into cars, then we'll look at the series and who are the offenders. We often know who our regular offenders are, and they go through the criminal justice system, and that comes back to rehabilitation and making sure that we try and get them off that pathway. And we have, for those that are a serious acquisitive crime nominals, we have an integrated offender management team that actually try and work with partners to get them out of the offending nature. So we monitor theft from motor vehicles and theft of motor vehicles. And recently, from a theft of motor vehicle, we had quite an increase in catalytic converters. So we took a whole system approach of looking what the problem is, looking why they're taking the catalytic converters, and therefore what's our response. And that works from everything from us giving post identifying the type of vehicle, going out proactively with smart water kits to individuals and industry, supported those as well as the PCC, and then we also looked at working with industry to understand why they was being stolen and what the market was there to try and stop it. We put some really quick interventions in. We're seeing catalytic converter thefts drop. However, we still see many of the public leaving their valuables on show in car parks. Some of the crimes I've looked through recently, we dip sample some of the crimes to look at the quality of investigations and see where we need to, if there's any learning, etc. But some of the vehicle crimes, people are still leaving their bags and their belongings on show, and then their windows are being smashed. So we use lots of crime prevention tactics to try and remind people and nudge people. But we do actively monitor it and respond where there's a crime series. But my plea is to the public to please, where possible, secure your vehicle, make sure there's no valuables on show, and hopefully that will help. But we will proactively target offenders who we know, and of course we have our PCSOs where we and neighbourhood staff where we look at hotspot policing. So if we know a location is a problem, we would look at hotspot policing tactics, which is an evidence-based model, which basically means we intensify our activity in that area at periods of time of the day in order to try and get intelligence to disrupt and provide that reassurance to the public.
And from okay, so I'll just finish that off, and then great, we'll talk about e-scooters. From the point of view of going forward, the increase in the neighbourhood policing team, the visibility that will bring, the fact that there will be more police on the streets will help from the point of view of basically the things like vehicle theft, etc. Mark, there's a couple of specific things people have said in the comments around this. So what I think we'll do, as they're specific to certain areas, I think what we'll do is we'll take them offline and get a response back to them. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
So Jack Brown, I'm not sure if it's already been brought up, but in terms of private scooters, they seem to be everywhere and never seen one get seized, but I've seen them ride past police officers on foot in town and they did nothing to stop them. The only people I see educating these people is BCP council workers.
Okay, so shall I do that first?
Yeah, if you want to do it first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, so thank you for that. This was the thing which was in my post bag the most for the first 2 months when I came into office in May. Very clearly, and here's the rub. This could be a transformative form of transport, but at this moment in time, legislation hasn't kept up with it. If you actually look at what people like motorbike groups are saying about e-scooters, they've got it absolutely right. They are lobbying government and they are saying, look, you need motor insurance, you need a driving license, you need a helmet, you need training. So basically this thing should be looked at as a moped or a motorcycle. That's what motorcycle groups are saying. From the point of view of the actual situation, if it is an electric scooter, it is not legal to use it on any public land in Dorset. The only ones which are legal are those within the Beryl Scooter Hire Scheme operated within BCP. So because of this post bag, I raised it with the force immediately. And since then, there has been quite a lot of work done about seizing scooters. I have been to the garage which has the seized scooters in it. And to be fair, what we did was we started off by educating. Then it became pretty obvious that we needed to take some off the streets. I have also been to see Beryl scooters, and they are increasing the information about how to complain about those people who are using their scooters in an antisocial way. So very clearly, we're doing things about this. Mark, do you want to talk about it from the operational end?
Yeah, so we are actively doing lots of work. So we've done all the communications, we're enforcing where required. Obviously, that's involves seizing scooters as well. Our officers do seize scooters. However, just for clarity, in terms of just because a police officer doesn't stop someone in a scooter if they're driving by, it may be that they're going to a higher priority, such as domestic abuse or a missing child or etc. So they have to prioritize their workload. We get intelligence, and again through our traffic departments and through our road safety teams. So I receive information through about individuals who are repeatedly driving on them. So then we can be intelligence led and target them. But certainly our officers work really hard. They will, wherever they can, intervene, give advice, and try and educate the public, because that's a key thing. Because there's nothing stopping people having one seize and then going out and buying another one. So the education is really, really important. We are seizing lots of scooters, and we're also starting through schools, etc., to try and interview schools. So actually get early education so people understand the rights and wrongs of what they can and do. I appreciate it's frustrating, but we're doing everything we can. But I won't, my officers have got to prioritize those high harm, high risk cases, and they, if they're going on the way to a burglary dwelling, so a house burglary or a domestic abuse incident, or somebody's been seriously injured, that will take their priority on that occasion. But I do know my local patrol officers are targeting people as well, because I've seen it. David Sidwick, Dorset Police and Crime Commissioner, have you put any changes in place yet to support businesses regarding shoplifting and the procedures in dealing with crime, rather than just sending theft packs out a week later?
Thank you, Adam. The answer to that is this is a work in progress. So what I've done is I've engaged with business groups. I've had them all in. We're starting a business crime reduction board in the next month. The issue, as you rightly say, is about reporting. And the current way of reporting with the theft packs isn't efficient. So we are looking at different ways in order to address that. And this is now the highest priority. It was talked about on Monday at the regular meeting that I have with the chief constable and his senior officers. So whilst we don't have a solution yet, we are working hard in order to get that.
I can probably add to that. One of my
Okay.
other portfolios is what we call the Incident Resolution Centre, so desk-based investigation around these things, and they deal with the theft packs. We're looking at ways in which we can use things like Good Sam about getting CCTV footage and streamline and make things more efficient. So that there is, from an operations perspective, from my perspective, we're currently reviewing that process and actually how we make sure we bring offenders to justice around those shopliftings as well. And do prevention activity.
And I think the other point I should make a little bit like the e-scooters, I've raised business crime as a significant priority for the force. Let's be honest, business and retail crime wasn't a priority nationally until about 18 months ago. It was only then that we got a police and crime commissioner who had a portfolio on retail crime. And it's something which needs to be addressed. So we are driving hard for it. We are driving for the solution which is badly needed, which is about ease of reporting. But again, it is the neighbourhood policing team. It is that increase which will allow greater capability in order to address crime in our businesses.
So I think just before I come to this question, I think there's just some questions that are coming today that are focused on Dorset County areas, so Weymouth down through Ferndown, North Dorset, etc. And there'll obviously be the chat tomorrow with Richard Bell as the Chief Superintendent and David as well tomorrow around the county. So we won't get to those Dorset County questions. This will just be focused on BCP. So I think we've got maybe this question, and if we have time for one more, but from Susan Walton, do you go into schools? And do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I do go into schools, but I go into schools in order to talk about my role, or I go, for example, to visit the police cadets. I think what the question is really asking is what educationally do you do in schools, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a strategic perspective, we work closely with the Director of Education, and that's through all the partnership working that we talk about. And we also work with the virtual schools, which focus on pupil referral units. So in terms of dedicated work with our schools, our Safer Schools team have PCSOs, and they're dedicated to schools in the BCP area. They also work with the pupil referral units, and we have an education program. If you go on the Safer Schools website through Dorset Police website, you can even see the types of products that we're using to educate children, everything from knife crime to danger awareness, etc. Our local PCSOs and our neighbourhood teams and our community officers also go into school, and it's about building relationships up with young children all the way up from your infants, your primary, up and through to your secondary schools. The idea being we don't want the children to be frightened of the police. We want to see the police as a positive thing and people engage with it so we can help them. So absolutely, we're in schools actively day to day. And certainly a big part of what we do is around prevention, education around the types of crimes that we're doing and working with those. But if you're interested, have a look at the Safe Schools website. There's a lot of information on there that you'll be able to have a look at what we do. I'm not sure how many more questions you want to take, time to take, David, or whether you want to keep going or...
I think we've got about 6 minutes. I think I'll briefly answer this one.
Yeah, and we'll see if there's any more.
Yeah, and then I think I'll talk generally about some of the questions which are in the comments, because I think there is ways that we can actually satisfy the people who are asking those questions, even though we can't talk about it here, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's briefly do this one. What makes Bournemouth in particular so lucrative for people as far away as Merseyside? This has been happening since the 80s. To give you some context, when we talk about county lines and we're looking at where they come from, about 15% comes from Merseyside, about 5% comes from the West Midlands, and 80% comes from London. And it is as simple as this. It is demand. If they can find that they can sell the stuff here, then they will come here and do it. There are probably some other issues around that. If I look at if I'm blunt, if I look at the previous policing crime plan, it did not have tackling drugs as a high priority from an enforcement point of view. Now, we are intent on doing that. We are intent on making this county a hostile environment. We want drug dealers to think, no, I'm not going to Dorset, because what's going to happen in Dorset is we will take your stuff away from you. We will take your money away from you. And ultimately, we will take your liberty away from you. That's where we need to be. So that's a very quick answer. You know, this is one of the areas I am absolutely intent that we get right going forward. 4 minutes. Right. In the comments, what we've got is we've got some comments which are very clearly about things which have happened. And obviously there hasn't been a situation which the person involved has been happy about. Now, those sorts of things, those individual things like that, if you email in about it, then we can get you an answer about it. There's also some questions about very much the Dorset County area. So Weymouth, Ferndown, etc. There is also questions about rural crime. Basically, I'll deal with that very specifically with Richard Bell tomorrow. And if those people want to send those questions in tomorrow, then obviously we'll be able to answer them. We had to focus very clearly on the BCP area today, and the Dorset area is for tomorrow. But look, thank you. Thank you very much for engagement. Thank you very much for the questions. I think very clearly we have an engaged population out there. I hope that what we said made sense. I hope that it gives you some semblance of hope. I'd like to thank everyone who took part and made it possible. And look, if you haven't responded to my survey, please go on with dorsetpolicefunding.uk. Remember, this session will be put up on YouTube shortly, so please look out for it. And very much good night. Thank you. Best wishes for 2022, and take care and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.